Okay, Kate, I think we should make a start. Great. So we've been saying welcome, but I want to say a very, very warm welcome to all of you here. This is such an important launch of a new project called Living with the Climate Crisis. Randall and Andy Brown's creation of a previous project, Carbon Conversations, which launched 16 years ago in 2007, was the applying of psychological and psychodynamic understanding to how to reduce your personal carbon footprint. It was groundbreaking. In many ways, it was the forerunner of projects inside and outside Climate Psychology Alliance. It really showed the way as to what climate psychology might be. It particularly exemplified working in groups, taking therapy space thinking outside of the consulting room, and yet holding on to nuanced psychological understandings. Ro and Andy estimate that possibly 12,500 people in the UK and internationally took part in carbon conversation groups. And there was evidence that people typically halved their carbon footprint when the research was done. That's likely to be an underestimate for the reach of the materials, both the Carbon Conversations Handbook and the book In Time for Tomorrow, because they've been taken into many other contexts and influenced other people's work. So thank you, Ro and Andy, for your pioneering courage then. And now they've done it again. Perhaps there was a thought there might not be another project. Perhaps Welcome Retirement beckoned. And then something new gestated. And wonderfully, Climate Psychology Alliance were invited to partner in this. I can remember when that was first mentioned, and I was really excited. Let me talk you through this evening. It's in 5 main sections. First of all, 4 of the creators of this project, the 4 main creators, Ro, Rebecca, Andy, and Daniela, will talk about its development. Then we'll hear how the materials operate in practice. Then there'll be a reflective space with a poem and a chance for you to think about what you've heard so far. Then there'll be a chance for your questions. And we will end, because this is also a celebration, even though the subject is so serious, we will end by cheering the project on its way. A couple of practical points. Because wonderfully, there are so many of you here, we will use the chat for the Q&A. And during the presentations, Kate has switched the chat function off to avoid distractions. And also, please don't worry if your question doesn't get answered. This is not the only chance to find out more. And as you will hear, support and discussion will be ongoing. And so I'm now briefly going to introduce the next 4 speakers. Rosemary Randall is a psychotherapist with a long history of involvement in the climate movement, who has written and published widely on the psychology of climate change. She is co-founder with Andy Brown of the Carbon Conversations Project, a founder member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, and is currently active with Cambridge Climate Therapists. Rebecca Nestor is a facilitator, researcher, and organizational consultant whose work supports people facing the climate crisis. She's on the board of Climate Psychology Alliance and chairs Low Carbon Oxford North. Daniela Fernandez-Catherall is a 3rd member of the team, and she's a chartered clinical psychologist, originally from Brazil, but living in the UK for more than 20 years, working in mental health for the NHS. She joined the Cambridge Climate Therapist Group 4 years ago and since then has been helping the local community with climate change related issues. And finally, Andy Brown is an engineer with a background in the social sciences. Before retirement, he worked in research for the built environment. He's co-founder of the Carbon Conversations project and has been a lifelong supporter of environmental causes. So over to you, Ro, to talk about the thinking behind the project.
Thank you very much, Judith. So, living with the climate crisis started with some conversations that Rebecca and I had in late 2021 about how much the needs and the experiences of people in the climate movement had changed since we both got involved in the 2000s. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, it's a period where IPCC reports became increasingly alarming, emissions and extreme weather events have increased. Here in the UK, we've seen awful backtracking by government on climate commitments, craven support for the fossil fuel industries, and the repeal or abandonment of environmental legislation. So in many ways, it's been a very, very difficult period in the last 10, 12 years or so. But also since 2018-19, we've seen a new wave of climate activists getting involved. And we've also seen the climate movement reflecting very seriously on issues of justice and diversity and inclusion, coupled with a lot more psychological practitioners getting involved. And so for us, we were reflecting on this very changed situation. And we talked about the enormous variety of psychological distress that we were encountering. We were meeting young people whose trust in government was gone, couples who no longer felt it was ethical to have children, activists who were burnt out and traumatized, climate scientists who were on the edge of despair, and ecologists overwhelmed by grief. And in the same time, people in everyday encounters would shudder and tell us if we remarked on the strange weather that they would rather not think about it. So like a lot of you, we were seeing just a huge variety of different psychological reactions and a lot of very acute psychological distress, which itself was very, very varied. There was the acute distress that comes from a recent awakening to the issue, and the shock and the rage and the fear and the disbelief, that sense of life suddenly being turned upside down. But also the ongoing feelings of dread or despair, the anxiety, the shame, the anger, the guilt, the grief and the loss, and the feelings of failure, exhaustion and burnout that we were meeting amongst seasoned campaigners. So this maelstrom of really difficult experience was the subject of several long conversations between Rebecca and myself, which I was also having with Daniela and my colleagues in Cambridge Climate Therapists. But the practical question that these experiences inspired in us was, what should we be doing in the psychological professions practically about this? And we realized that we wanted to build on our previous climate and psychological work, centrally on our group work experience. Our experience of facilitated small groups has been very central to our thinking. We wanted to build on the old Carbon Conversations project, and we wanted to build on the debriefs, the communication workshops, the climate cafes and other activities that we were doing with activists. We wanted to create something that could be used flexibly by other psychological practitioners in the communities that they were embedded in, and offer something that could replace the now outdated Carbon Conversations project. So we brought Daniela in at this point, whose community psychology experience has been invaluable, and Andy, who we persuaded to contribute the technical information that we would need. And so the result is the set of materials which Daniela and Rebecca are going to talk about in more detail, which can be used by people with facilitation skills to create groups which address the climate-related dilemmas of our times. At the heart of it's the small facilitated group embedded in a local community, which is something we come to value for its ability to help people support each other, to be a focus for learning, and to help people find their way towards the actions that feel right and sustainable for them. We do need to say that in offering these materials, we're very aware of the limitations of our own backgrounds and experiences, of the profound need for the climate movement to move beyond what has sometimes been a narrow, if unwitting focus on people like ourselves. And what we hope is that facilitators will be able to take what they need from the materials that we've produced and to adapt and expand and to change them to work with the groups that they're involved with. Throughout these materials, we use a metaphor, the metaphor of the ecosystem, to try to reflect the diversity and the interdependence that the climate movement needs, and to express our hope that people will not only use these materials, but will use them flexibly, adapting them to their own communities and to those communities' needs. So that's all I'm going to say for now, and I'm going to hand over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Ro. I'm going to share my screen to show everyone the some screenshots of the materials that we have put together. So the first and probably biggest, most central set of materials is the Facilitator's Guide. The second is the Handbook for Participants. The third is the Living Lightly Guide, a guide to carbon reduction for participants. And the fourth is a set of slides that facilitators can use if they wish. So I will say a little bit more about each of these in turn now. The Facilitator's Guide is a really comprehensive handbook for people who are facilitating living with the climate crisis groups. And it has 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we look at climate psychology, exploring climate distress, loss and grief, the idea of the climate journey, and touching on other key concepts like burnout and disavowal and climate trauma. In chapter 2, we talk about our approach to working in groups, and we discuss some of the key issues that might face facilitators when working on living with the climate crisis. We discuss, for example, the skills that they will need, and you can see the sample page that I'm showing on this slide, which is from chapter 2 and talks about the range of facilitator backgrounds that might be helpful, and the challenges perhaps also that people might face. And we also talk about how to recruit a group and issues of running the groups online or in person. Chapter 3, we look in more detail at the approaches and methods that we use in each part of living with the climate crisis, the 3 modules that it consists of. And in this particular chapter, we outline the background to the activities, in terms of the various forms of psychotherapy, group work, experiential learning, and systems thinking. And we suggest some reading that may help facilitators who are unfamiliar with any of them. And then in chapter 4, we provide step-by-step guidance for running each session with timed session plans and the optional PowerPoint slides showing you whereabouts in each session they might appear. But I would like to emphasize what Ro has just said, that we really hope that people will use the materials flexibly. We think it's helpful to provide the detail because you can see what it looks like, what we mean by how it would run, but we're not expecting people to follow them slavishly. So the next slide, this is the Participants Handbook. And how this works is that it is designed to help people keep track of the programme as they run through the components of it week by week. And so it contains background information on some of the topics. It contains some instructions for some of the activities that people do in the groups, and it contains some reminders of some of the issues covered, for example, climate grief, or how to communicate effectively. And what you can see in the sample page here is an example from Module 1, which summarises for the participants some aspects of climate distress, some ways in which it might play out, and kind of explaining how people can maybe think about this and look after each other. The next slide shows you the front cover of Living Lightly. Now, this is the document that was written particularly by Andy, but also by Ro, with some input from Daniela and myself. And this is guidance on reducing your personal carbon footprint, again, written for group participants. In Living with the Climate Crisis, we have one session specifically on this topic, which for those of you who've worked on carbon conversations in the past, you'll see how much we have had to shrink and summarize the materials. And for the most part, in fact, participants are invited to work through these topics outside the meetings with their buddies that we ask them to create. And how Living Lightly works is that it explains the impact of an ordinary UK lifestyle and talks about how making changes to your diet, travel, purchases and home energy can make a difference. And we have, or Andy and Ro in particular, have updated and drastically summarized the materials from the original Carbon Conversations project and the In Time for Tomorrow book. And as with the previous slides, I'm showing you a sample page here. This is from the travel chapter, and it shows you the force field analysis that we use in this particular session, focusing on travel, but force field analysis can be used for any carbon reduction dilemma. And then finally, we have produced some PowerPoint slides. Now, these are a mix of instructions for activities that you can use in the sessions if you want as facilitators, but also presentation materials for the short talks that facilitators may be wanting to offer during some meetings. And again, you can use the slides to present the ideas if you wish, but you can also just talk through the topics, and we think either is fine. We want you to feel free to use them or not as you choose. So I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I will hand over to Daniela.
Thank you, Rebecca, for introducing materials. I am going to be talking now about how we organized the 10 sessions of a Living with Climate Crisis group in 3 modules and their aims. Rebecca, sorry to bother you. Maybe the idea of sharing the slide of the 3 modules might be good now. Could you do that? You deleted it.
I deleted that, I'm sorry.
No worries. So I'm going to be talking about 3 modules. So the first module is coming together and putting down roots. And the aim of this module is to create a safe space for exploration, connection, and collaboration within the group to occur. It uses the Tree of Life collective narrative methodology developed by David Edinburgh and Nazelo Nube-Milo, both respectively from Australia and South Africa, and invites participants to remember what are their values, the important people stories in their lives, and what were their hopes and dreams. This process involves sharing of those trees in the formation of like a metaphorical forest. And within the strength of this forest, then, we do invite participants to explore their climate distress, their loss and grief, and their journey through this path. So in module 2, communication, we move on to support participants to build on their communication skills with others through talking to family and friends and talking to members of the public. For this, we use the ideas from public narrative from Marshall Gans from the US, and also ideas from psychotherapy about content and process. So the aim there is to develop and refine their own stories. In module 3, the ecosystem change, we will use ideas from system theory and practice, as well as the science of carbon reduction. The aim here is to encourage participants to explore beyond the safety of the group into the surrounding areas from where they live. This is where the importance of the group being made of people who are part of the same community is most relevant, as they can start to identify and plan what to do with their immediate environment. In this module, we recommend that these conversation plans continue outside the group. So we encourage buddy work outside the group sessions, and as well as that this work carries on after the group has ended. So having a common ground, such as belonging to the same community, and by this I don't mean necessarily just the physical geographical community, but could be a community of peers or people with a shared experience within a society, allows participants to refer constantly not only to their inner difficulties and their inner experience, but also to the shared external reality, like the places, the people, the history, the organizations, and the difficulties they face together. This grounding within this collectively lived space allows possibilities of being and acting in the immediate world that were unimaginable individually. Enable people to address together their internal turmoil and conflicts, allowed for the renewing of their sense of agency, in which they can reclaim their space within their ecosystem, not only to address their personal challenges, but also the community challenges. These ideas are not new. They have they have been around since the 1970s. A lot of within the collective narrative practice and community psychology ideas have its roots in the work of Paulo Freire from Brazil. And there are some great examples of community psychology going on everywhere, but in particular in the UK are the ones that I know of. And what we've done now, I think Rose said, I think Carbon Conversations already encouraged the small group and the group think and thinking about psychological issues, but we have made this more dominant, I think, in this version of the Living Climate Crisis. I would like to talk, just before I finish, about the facilitation of this group. So this group is not a therapeutic group, but it definitely has some therapeutic effects. And people are invited to share personal stories and connect with distressing experiences. So we imagine that this group should be facilitated by people living in the same community of the participants to continue with their shared reality, but also that people should have experience running groups. So this could be teachers, community workers, religious leaders, environmentalists, just to mention a few. We do, however, understand there is a strong emotional content embedded within the process of this group. And also we have had feedback of some experiential workshops we've done with people thinking facilitating. So we do encourage that at least one of the facilitators could have some training within the psychological professions or have the support of or be supervised by. And with this, the CPA has some good ideas of how they're going to support facilitators doing living in climate crisis groups in the future. And Rebecca is going to talk about that later. But now I will pass it to Andy to talk a little bit about Living Lightly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. So I get to talk about numbers. So over the 15 years since Rosemary and I wrote the Carbon Conversations materials, we've seen an increasing level of carbon literacy, alongside arguments that say individual carbon reduction is not the central issue and is a distraction from exerting political pressure for climate and policy change. This did raise questions for the team about whether the discussion of carbon reduction should be part of the new project. And our conclusion was that carbon literacy, or I prefer to say carbon numeracy, still matters. Many interventions require knowledge of what makes a big or a small difference, whether that's at home or in the organizations we're involved with or at work. At the personal level, reducing your own carbon impact is also a way of preparing for the future and living in accordance with your values. So understanding your carbon footprint can help you focus on the actions that are significant and stop you fretting about small changes, and inform the rest of your campaigning and your conversations about the climate crisis. So we decided to include some materials on carbon reduction in the new project. One of the sessions, as Rebecca said, introduces this, and group members are then left to work through Living Lightly booklet outside the group, taking from it what they wish. Those familiar with Carbon Conversations will recognise much of the content of Living Lightly, as it's really a shortened and updated version of the old materials, and brings many of our principles of carbon conversations with it. We still stress the importance of evaluating your own footprint, or now we point to available calculators online. In particular, the Open University Open Learning course, Treading Lightly on the Earth, as a calculator, which is the scion of the original CAT Carbon Gym calculator that we adapted and refined for the Carbon Conversations project back in 2007. Knowing your own emissions makes the difficulties of reaching a sustainable world concrete and helps you set realistic targets. Like Carbon Conversations, Living Lightly discusses the problems of reducing carbon emissions on both a technical and a psychological level and provides space to discuss these issues. We look at general principles and we discuss issues around housing and food and travel and spending in more detail. And we retain from Carbon Conversations the list of actions, primarily as they include our star ratings, which allow you to see the relative impact of the changes you make. We've also kept the rules of thumb, which provide a helpful reminder for your day-to-day life. So like everything in Living with the Climate Crisis group, the emphasis is given to this aspect. It's for the group, it's for the facilitators to decide how they want to take it and the needs of their particular group. So we hope we've provided sufficient and sensible material for you to make this an easy task. And I think we're back to Judith to take this meeting further. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. You are right. So I hope that's laid the groundwork for moving on tonight. And so what we're going to do now is hear more about the practicalities and experience of the trials, the prototypes that have already been run. And Daniela and Rebecca will speak about this, but they're going to be joined by Teresa, who has worked in a number of fields over the years, including being a primary school teacher, a writer and editor, and the coordinator of a small mental health charity. For the last 4 years, she has been a very busy climate activist, and she joins us as somebody who has taken part as a participant in living with the climate crisis.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Can I just introduce Kate and then I'll pass over to you, Teresa?
Sorry.
Yeah, no problems, no problems. Kate Dufton is also going to be speaking from the experience of working through running a Living with the Climate Crisis group. Kate is a retired psychiatrist and medical psychotherapist living in Wales, and she's been the honorary secretary of the CPA for some years. She's an extraordinary person who brings an imaginative sensitivity to everything she does within CPA. So, Teresa, if you can kick us off with your experience of the Living with the Climate Crisis group.
Thanks. Sorry for coming in a bit early. So I'll start by giving a bit of context, which you did a little bit. For over 3 years before I did the course, I'd been very involved in the climate movement in Extinction Rebellion, and this had involved a number of arrests and the ongoing uncertainty of court cases. By the time I was one of the new wave that was referred to earlier, and by the time I did the course, climate activists, time had moved on, and climate activists were certainly in the British press branded as eco-zealots, tofu-eating wokerati, who were only out to needlessly disrupt people's lives and stop them getting to hospitals when they needed to. And during the whole COVID pandemic, I found that my friends had moved on from climate being a major concern at the forefront of their lives, but that wasn't the same for me. And I felt the need for some grounding and to feel that I could talk about some of the really difficult feelings that were coming up. Ro mentioned some of these, but I felt very strong sadness and also rage. And I felt that the rage was getting more airtime than the love, and it seemed to be eating away at me. And I didn't want to become bitter and negative, and I didn't want to lose hope. So the course came at just the right time for me. When we started walking into the woods for the first day, I knew that it was the right thing to be doing. And we got to know each other amazingly quickly, surrounded by trees in our own little ecosystem in the middle of a beautiful autumnal woods just outside Oxford. It helped that we were all committed to this journey, and we had brilliant facilitators, Rebecca and Paula. And we were all very different. Some of us had been active together, but others were not involved in any activism and didn't want to be. And this was a great chance, and sometimes a bit of a challenge, to be with people who were living in the climate crisis in a different way to me. But what this course really gave me was what I call some tools for resilience. I remember a really good session and role play on how to talk with friends and family about living in the climate crisis, and the group offered thoughts and feedback. And I found that I've been gradually able to use these tools in my life. In fact, I've had some really good conversations with friends because I'm able to do a bit more listening and I don't get as frustrated. And this has meant that I can appreciate more where they're coming from. I'm not saying that everything has shifted and it's all fantastically hunky-dory now, because it's not. But I am more grounded and I'm not so overwhelmed by what maybe the indifferent responses of others. One huge plus that's been mentioned is the buddy system. And I met my buddy almost every week, and together we reflected on what we were learning from the course. I felt really listened to and sometimes very gently challenged. And I hope that Sue, my buddy, felt the same too. It was a great part of it. What else have I taken away from the course? I've learned that I can't care for the planet unless I also care for myself. I'm still just as active, but I do deliberately give myself breaks, and I don't feel too bad about doing this, which I think I did before. I realize I'm in it for the long haul and I need to pace myself. I've also absorbed the value of talking about feelings around the climate emergency, and I can support those around me, particularly my two daughters, much better because of that. After the course, my oldest daughter and I started recording a short audio diary at regular intervals, and we talk about how we're feeling and try to listen to each other. And it's an amazing record of what's going on for us. At the start of the course, I wrote a postcard every week during the course. And in the first one, I wrote, "I feel rage" in big capital letters, and that I wish that I could be more accepting of those who weren't acting. But I'm going to finish by sharing my last postcard, the picture of it. If you can do that, Rebecca. And what I wrote alongside this picture, on the back of it, I wrote, "This tells me how putting together 1,000 separate pieces can create a beautiful whole. Maybe that's how it is with climate activism. We never know where the journey will lead, what the outcome will be. It's an act of faith, active hope, a journey." So I know that this course really helped me on this journey. It's a really important one to go on, really important that it exists. I feel much more resilient and I think a lot about what I've learned. And I'm so grateful to Paula and Rebecca for leading us so skillfully and to have had the opportunity to do it. So thank you, and I recommend it to everyone.
Well, thank you, Teresa. I actually felt quite emotional with your last postcard. I am going to talk a little bit more now about something that Ro mentioned, the idea of being flexible and use this material in all sorts of ways. So as I mentioned before, Living with Climate Crisis group is composed of 10 distinct 2-hour sessions with a specific exercise and guided discussions focused on a different topic each session. This format can and should be adapted to the needs of the group. The facilitator's guide includes ideas about how to adapt them, such as combining module one in one long session like a workshop, and I believe that's what Teresa was referring to when they were walking to the woods in the first session in the Oxford group. And then following up with 7 smaller sessions, but this is just a suggestion that there will be other suggestions. I think whichever adaptation is made, the facilitators have to take in consideration that they need the time to process the feelings, the information, and the ideas in each one of the sessions. And also, as Teresa said, there will be time required outside the sessions for participants to meet with their buddies and support each other and plan things together. We do expect and hope that great group initiatives are already happening around the world, and that people will use from Living with Climate Crisis material what works for them. Parts of material can be adapted, can incorporate in other group practices, perhaps can even be used in standalone workshops for a specific audience. I think it would depend very much on what is needed. And we are hoping that the Living with Climate Crisis website would become a place in which the stories of how it's being adapted, developed, innovated, would come back to be shared with others to kind of build on this work. As Ro mentioned in the beginning, we see the Living with Climate Crisis very much as another tool within the ecosystem of supportive groups that are already around. And we do not claim the Living with Climate Crisis as all the answers for everything. We are aware of its limitations. It is a longer process. It has a lot of content to be delivered at fast pace. It requires a lot of reading and writing from both participants and facilitators. And just to mention a few, and I think there's other thing that we ask people to not charge from the participants a payment for attending the group. But we do encourage facilitators to seek for funding, seek for grants, international, national, local grants within charities to have their time funded to deliver this course. And to finalize, I would like to say that we're deeply aware in developing the Living with Climate Crisis groups that this has been produced in the privileged, developed world of the United Kingdom by us authors who are highly educated, white middle-class people who are not at all at the front line of the climate crisis, and neither are part of the high-risk groups already facing the dramatic impact of the climate change. We do, however, feel that it's even more important for us, being part of this group, to try to address these issues within our overdeveloped world and with our privileged lives. And we are aware we are part of this group with the highest CO2 emission, one of the highest CO2 emissions in the world, and is unfortunately very strict and ongoing cultural, historical, financial, agricultural, and work practices that keep the emissions high and disproportionately impacting the rest of the world. Just really would like to mention this, and we really encourage to hear from people different from us and from other practices and to learn from them as well. So now I will pass it to Kate to talk about her experience.
Hello, so I'm going to speak about a group of privilege, in fact, but also a very different kind of group from Teresa's group. So I'm a participant and co-facilitator in using Living with the Climate Crisis with an online group of medical mothers. So this was an invite that came via CPA from Melanie Knowles, who had pulled the group together. So thank you to Melanie, who I hope is here. Medical mothers are in an eye of the storm. I think I'm imagining a storm with lots of eyes. And I keep thinking medical parents as well, but parents of little ones looking ahead like any other parents. And as medics in an unsustainable health and social care system, also where the medical model's been so captured that people in radical circles can no longer even question what it balances. So it's just the bad thing, industrialized, dehumanized, and unsustainable. The group came out of the much larger online Facebook group, I think, of medical mothers. And in that group, there was the familiar silence and difficulty responding to any comments about climate breakdown, climate crisis. So a very different context than Teresa's. In living with the climate crisis, we found ourselves with the comfort of trees, which have been mentioned, a connection of trees, invited to be a grove or little forest together as we shared experience and feeling. And this was really nourishing and interesting, thought-provoking, strengthening, playful, linking into much else from our lives. We're only about halfway through the communication sessions, and it's challenging. I do want to say that it's challenging, it's hard. I'm finding it hard as a participant facilitator. Who are the us we call upon, and what are the vision and action that we're seeking to follow? But I was going to say, so the group is both lovely and a challenge, some of it quite tough. So we've had to be flexible, take more time, move things around a bit. So very much following on from what the authors have invited us to be. I'm very grateful for that flexibility. I think because of time, I might leave it there, Judith, or hand back to Rebecca, isn't it, next?
Yes.
To say thank you.
Thank you. And I know you could have said more. So over to Rebecca.
Thank you. I too was very touched by Teresa's contribution. Thank you very much indeed. And to everyone who's spoken so far. So I have two jobs right now. The first is to say a huge thank you to everyone who has made this project possible. Mentioning Teresa, I think I will start with the two pilot groups. So we had a pilot group about this time last year, online, but people based in both Oxford and Cambridge, and I know at least one of those people is here. Thank you to both the Cambridge and the Oxford groups who took part in the online pilot, and also thank you to Teresa's group, who, as she said, was so committed and so tenacious about turning up and doing the work when it was hard, as Kate has said. And the feedback and the experience of doing the pilots taught us so much. I can't even begin to say how valuable it was. So that's the first thank you. The second thank you is to the people who contributed quite a large amount of money from various sources, from small individual contributions to very large chunks that enabled us to produce what we think are fantastically beautiful materials. They're designed by Karen Leahy for us, and to create the website. And then from all those individuals who've made those contributions, I want also to thank the Climate Psychology Alliance, which has been so warm and welcoming and excited by the prospect of creating and hosting Living with the Climate Crisis. So on behalf of the authors, I want to communicate my thanks to CPA. Thank you all very much, Kate and Judith and everyone else who's here from CPA. And of course, none of this would be either kind of possible or needed without the existence of the climate movement, which has slogged through a huge amount of work and suffering and pain, and with tenacity, with determination, and it has not given up, despite the sense of despair and the other emotional challenges that we're all facing in this movement. So that's my thank you. There are probably more people to thank, and if I have forgotten, I apologize. And I will share my screen briefly to make a couple of points under my second heading, which is the training and support that we are hoping to offer, and we have already begun offering, for facilitators and people who want to be facilitators of living with the climate crisis. The first thing we suggest that facilitators can do is modelled by Kate's description of working through this with the Medical Mothers Group, forming small groups of people who might want to be facilitators, people who might only want to be participants but who haven't yet decided, just to work through the materials together, not in a full sense, but just like a book group, working through what it's like, what the materials mean, what you think it looks like when you might be running it as for a group. So that's the first thing we suggest. And if you're doing that and you would like one of us to come to a meeting of your small group, and you may have some questions you'd like to put to us, we will be very happy to receive those invitations, and we'll come along if we can. What we're also offering is experiential workshops, and Daniela and I are running these together. And they offer a chance to discuss with us and also experience some of the activities from living with the climate crisis. Not all of them. What we do is we ask participants to read the facilitator's guide and pick the activities they would most like to try out with us in the workshop. And we work on the basis of the ones that get the most votes. And we've done a couple of these so far. We've got another one coming up this week and a further one at the end of next week, and we will be continuing to schedule these. The fourth thing that we suggest you can do, and Kate, I'm hoping you can put the link to this in the chat, is that we have set up a Google form where you can put your details, your contact details, and where you are located. And we hope that this will help you to find potential co-facilitators near to where you live. So give us those details. We will share them appropriately with others who are nearby. And then finally, for those who are members of the Climate Psychology Alliance, we're offering regular reflective practice sessions for people who are facilitating living with the climate crisis. And we have a Living with the Climate Crisis facilitators group on our online community platform. And that is also a place to meet others and to discuss and to think about the programme. So I will stop there, and I'm going to hand back to Judith, I believe.
You are. Just briefly. So now we're going to change the pace and take some brief time to think and feel and breathe and listen to a poem. And after Ro has helped us just change gear, rather, Daniel Clark is going to read a poem. He's a writer, translator, and self-defined pessimist who's been nominated for Best Small Fictions, and he performed eco-poetry at COP26, and he co-edits a publication called Briefly Right. So he'll be reading a poem and talking about it later. But first of all, can I hand over to Ro now?
Thank you, Judith. I'm just going to ask you, because you've been listening and listening and listening to us for over 45 minutes now, to first of all, just look around the space that you're in and see if there is something through the window or in your room that connects you to the natural world. You might be looking out at your garden. You might have a window where you can see the sky. It might be that there's nothing you can look at because it's dark outside, but look around and think about how the objects in your space connect with the natural world. My eyes at the moment are on something that's come from the other side of the world, banana. But it takes me to a place that is very different from my head. So just take a moment and make that connection. And when you've got it, I'd like to ask you, if you would like to stand up and stretch. And just reach your hands as far up as you can. And just imagine that your hands can reach through the ceiling of the room that you're in, through all the floors above you, through the roof, until you can feel the energy and the vibrancy of the world outside the room and the world outside your head. And just draw down that energy into yourself. Move your head, move your arms, move your legs, move whatever part of you would like to move, and pull that energy that we're all part of into yourself. When you're ready, come and sit down, and I'll hand over to Daniel to tell us about his poem and read it to us.
Thank you, Ro, and thank you, Daniela, for inviting me here tonight. So the poem I'm going to read is called 16 Haiku. I performed it at COP26 in Glasgow a year and a half ago. It was chosen in an open competition run by Young Poets Network called Poems to Solve the Climate Crisis. And my poem offers no solution, at least not directly. I don't think any poem can solve the climate crisis. As a recent UN report stated quite starkly, emissions need to go down now. Poetry doesn't bring down emissions, but it can be used to encourage people to think differently and to take personal responsibility, and also to speak truth to power. So at COP26, I read a poem about the harms of animal agriculture to a room of about 200 delegates who were nibbling beef canapes and chattering amongst themselves at the back of the room. I'm sure the viewers here tonight are much more engaged for the planet and far less hypocritical than those delegates. But having that experience reminds me that poetry does have a role to play in terms of symbolism and meaning and reading between the lines, and ultimately understanding the impact of everything we say and everything we do. So his poem, the title is borrowed from the Greek poet Yorgos Seferis, and the first haiku I'm going to read will be his, as translated by Edmund Keeley and Philip Gerard. So if anyone is counting the haiku, there will be 17 in total, not 16. Empty chairs. The statues have gone back to the other museum. At the end of the garden, a pear tree, alone. Hair tied, silent sheep, eating nettles. He carves his name into his tree. The last rays, leaves reaching for light. Summer's breeze, plastic box, December. A plaque on a chair in a fire. Messages daubed indelible ink, washed away. Trash talk, cops and canapes. Promises in jet fumes. Salmon, swimming in silence, no current. Apathy appears the answer to our non-questions. Where were you when the seas were warming? Big leaf in a bottle. Beyond the trees, a cloud descended, Message in a bottle in rising seas. Ancient oak blinks 100 years. Empty chairs. The people have gone back to sleep. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. The phrase that resonated so powerfully for me there is that one, where were you? I think it's often a refrain that I have in my head of accusation sometimes to people, but also of question to myself. Where was I? What did I do? It's very powerful. So thank you. We're going to move in a moment to the question and answer session. And what I'd like you to do, you may remember that we asked you to bring a postcard with you, and you may also, you saw one of the postcards that we write during the group. Teresa shared one of the postcards that she had written to herself. And what I'd like you to do, if you have brought a postcard with you, is just to use these moments to write down your reactions, your feelings, your thoughts about any part of what you've heard so far this evening. You can make a note of any questions you have that you would like to ask. Just anything that you'd like to say. Just collect your thoughts. Any responses that you might have to Daniel's poem. This is also the moment to grab a celebratory object or drink that you'd like to show to the camera right at the end, just before we say goodbye. So we're just going to give you 2 minutes to scribble whatever you want in response to what you've heard. And then Judith will bring us back and introduce the question and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back, and Kate or Rachel, I wonder if you could open the chat so that people can start putting questions in, and I'm going to try and gather some of the questions, but Rebecca is also going to be reading the questions.
So the chat is open, and there have been a couple of questions earlier as well.
Yes.
Wow, so many questions already. And so many contributions. That's wonderful. Thank you, Marcia, for the response to the poem. That's absolutely glorious. So we have a question about successful funding applications, and we have, I think, a couple of questions about modifications and permissions. And then, so let's maybe start with the question about modifications and what we are happy for you to do and what we would request that you don't do with the materials. I'm going to push that question over to you, Ro. And please, everyone, please continue with the questions coming in. I'm going to
thank you. Modification of the actual written materials is something that you would need to write to us and say what it is you want to do. So, for example, if you're in another country and the carbon emissions data is quite different in your country, write to us and we will send you a form that you fill in and you tell us what you want to change, and we write back and say that's fine. So that's how that is done. For a lot of the adaptations that you want to make, you probably won't need to actually change anything that we've written. You'll simply be inserting our ideas or our material into something that you're running. So, for example, you might decide you want to do a day workshop in which you use our communications materials. You're not changing what we've written, which is what the Creative Commons license refers to. You're just changing the way that you're using it. So we hope that those two ways of thinking about adaptation will give you what you need. And similarly, of course, if you want to translate the material into another language, just write to us and we will draw up. There's a very straightforward agreement that we have prepared, which will allow you to translate and to put your own country's carbon emissions data into the materials for yourselves. Okay.
Thank you, Ro. That was very succinct, given the complexities. We have lots of wonderful reflections, and I won't comment on those because we want to try and do our best to answer the questions that are coming up. There's one that I think is very significant, which is from Anais, and it is, what material do we have to deal with the emotions related to the necessity of reducing the digital footprint? And I'm not entirely sure whether that's to do with digital footprint only or generally about reducing the carbon footprint. But I guess there are things we can say about how the materials respond to the emotional impact of reducing our footprints. And Daniela, would you like to say something about that?
If I understood the question, I think it gives you opportunity to review your carbon footprint and discuss with others. And there are some very difficult changes that people have to make that are really a huge impact on their lifestyle. For example, I think it's known that my family lives across the Atlantic, and for me to be able to go and see them, it's a huge carbon footprint. And I have to think very carefully how to do that and how that impacts on the rest of my life. So it can be very emotional to be able to face those realities from your life within the group. I don't know if that's quite the answer you're expecting. What do you think, Rebecca? Would you like to complement that?
I think you've responded to the question. Thank you very much. And I also want to pick up what was, when I started saying this, the most recent question, which is there a risk that taking part in living with the climate crisis or facilitating it can activate distress that people didn't previously have? I have some thoughts about that myself, but I'm going to ask Ro if she'd like to start off responding to it.
I think people vary hugely in the ways in which they respond emotionally to very, very difficult experiences. And I think one of the things about being in a group with a skilled facilitator is that they're able to understand that, and to offer some people the possibility of remaining in a way in their own safe space, allowing other people to express things which may be stronger or maybe more emotional. I think one of the things which you often do as a facilitator is making those judgments about how far out of their shell does somebody want to come in experiencing the difficult feelings. How much do they need to be holding on to something that protects them from it? And so I think that this is actually about the skill of facilitation primarily, because I would never want to be in a group where I had forced somebody to express or feel something that they couldn't manage. While at the same time, I would also want there to be just a little bit of a challenge, and perhaps to enable somebody to see that it is safe to feel things which perhaps they've been struggling with on their own, or trying not to think about, or which were coming out in other ways.
Thank you, Ro. And I have not very much to add, but I would just say from my experience of working with the Oxford pilot last autumn, I think I learned a lot from doing that. And one of the things I learned was the importance of respecting how people are managing for themselves in terms of their emotional experience of the climate and ecological crisis. So in other words, not as Rose says, not pushing people to explore their feelings if this isn't something that they are comfortable with, ready for, and if they in fact need perhaps the protections that we create around ourselves in response to this. And so there's a kind of invitation, I think, but not, I hope, any pressure to talk about feelings if this isn't something you do. So we had a couple of questions about funding, and I'm very pleased to see that people are beginning to answer that for themselves and for each other. I'm not sure that the author team can help very much with the question of funding, unless anyone does want to come in with some thoughts and suggestions. Ro, yeah. Oh, you're still muted.
I was just going to say that I think it's, when we were talking about funding, we were talking about not wanting people to be making money from this. We created this project as our contribution to the climate movement, and so it's not something that we want to be kind of used in that way. But we do recognise that there are people who might want to use it in settings where they might be paid because it's part of their job. And also that people who are running this in the community may need to ask group members to share in the cost of hiring the room that you use, for example, or providing refreshments or something like that. I think where we're talking about wanting funding, it's to be able to do it so that you pay your facilitators. If that's something which is necessary. And I think there are charitable foundations, charitable trusts, there are sometimes local authority schemes, there are sometimes other related bits of the environmental movement who might want to put on a group, and you could facilitate a group for them. There are all kinds of things which I think it's worth exploring if you're thinking about trying to get funding.
Yeah, thank you, Ro. And if people want to share examples of sources of funding in the chat, please do. And Judith, you're muted.
I spotted a couple of questions about individual carbon footprint, and I wondered if it was worth saying what came much earlier in the presentation, that part of the adaptation from carbon conversations to this has been very much to recognise that there are system changes that need to be made, which is why the carbon footprint, personal carbon footprint work is still there, but has been considerably slimmed down with much more focus on the emotional and on communication and on building connections and working in community. Is that fair?
Yes.
I just noticed those questions just coming up. there was also a question about is there a way to use the materials with people who are not engaged at all? And I wondered, I thought that was an interesting question. Rebecca.
Yeah, I think, and I link it as well with the question about how to go about recruiting groups. So well, I think what I would say is that it's quite likely that in advertising and recruiting a group, you're likely to attract people who are already engaged in some way. So I'm not trying to claim more for what I'm about to say than just a very limited way in which it will be possible to reach people who are not already active. I don't think we are about reaching people who don't believe there is a climate crisis. I don't think we're about reaching people who really have no idea that there is a climate crisis. Although if someone was interested and wanted to come along to find out more, I think the materials could be used to work with people in that category. It's just quite unlikely that they would come to you, I think. But what I would suggest is that you could expect that there will be in your group people who are already activists like Teresa and several others from the Oxford group. And there'll be people who are thinking, how can I get involved? What are the things I am capable of doing that I could bring to the climate crisis? People who've recently begun to think this is really serious, I need to make my contribution. And we did find in the Oxford group that we had a couple of people in that category. I would think that if you want to recruit more people in that category, it needs to be really clear in your advertising materials that that is what you're inviting, because then you can create a group that is mostly made up of people in that category, and it will be easier for them to come along, not to feel too ashamed about previous inexperience, and to kind of work out together what contribution they can make. Having said that, I think in the Oxford group there was a real benefit for those who were new to activism in hearing the experience of the activists. So it swings and roundabouts, as we say. And with the approach to recruiting groups, I think if you want to reach people who are outside your own bubble, it's probably worth putting a lot of effort into recruiting. That's not to say that we have had trouble recruiting, we absolutely haven't. But if you're wanting to reach people who are not involved in the green movement yet at all, then it will just be important to see if you can find funding for advertising, see if you can find ways of really getting the message beyond the climate movement. And there was another question that I was beginning to write down the answer to, but then I got sidetracked. Yes, I've lost it. There've been so many since. But I wanted to respond to Claire's question about the CPA's Climate Cafe initiative. I think Ro mentioned at the beginning that one of the things we talked about was the value of climate cafes in not expecting action from people, being a space where action can be temporarily set aside. And we do a little bit of that in Living with the Climate Crisis. And I've found it really wonderful how I'm working on climate cafes where we're not talking so much about action. And then I'm also working on Living with the Climate Crisis, where the idea is people move to action, and it just feels very complementary, and they draw materials and approaches from each other. Okay, Judith, do you have questions that you spotted that I missed while I was answering? Because that's what's happened to me.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, some of the questions were about what tools are there, and so I've done a reply to say, look, the materials are all up on the website so that you can see what those tools and what the design feature is.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's good to now go and have a look at the website and pick up those ideas. But there's a question from Manu about what are the design principles or tools that we use in living with the climate crisis that help with resilience. And I think that's a question for Daniela in particular.
Great question.
Yes, very good question. I have a little bit of issue with the word resilience, but let's go with that. I think we start trying to build on people's strength and resources by arriving in the group and creating the safety and connection and using the Tree of Life methodology. So that Tree of Life methodology is based in the ideas of narrative therapy that is about enable people to kind of choose and develop their preferred story rather than the story that has been imposed on them. So there's a lot of work in the initial module and in the session of the Tree of Life to build on that. So please do go and have a look at the facilitator guide. And if you're interested more in methodology, there's things written about that by Nazelo and Nembra. And there's even like specific training for that. But it is about open up to favorite stories and the things that inspire you in life and telling to others in a pair, in a group, and recurrently going back to that story and make it bigger through the project. So that's one way to build some resilience. But I think throughout the group and throughout the group process, the connectiveness and the activities encourage people to share and find that common ground, which is also a very strengthening process.
Thank you. Ro, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think this idea of how we become sustainable in our activism is really, really important. And how we find a balance between the different sorts of things which we do is also very important. Because I think some of the actions that people engage on are of necessity extremely painful and difficult. I think a lot of political action, it leads to change, but it is also often very slow. It's often very painful. There's often a great sense of failure. There's often a sense of being in the face of aggression. And I think that to balance the work that you do in that sort of area, that hard political work, with other sustaining kinds of activities, which may be to do with volunteering at a growing project, for example, spending time in a garden, spending time doing things with other people. These may be climate-related activities, and often I think those are often the most restorative, the ones perhaps where you're spending time in the natural world, creating habitat, that kind of thing. But also just simply having time with friends, going out and getting plastered, if that's your thing, having a really good night out and allowing yourself to live fully. Because I think one of the things which we're saying very strongly in this project is that living with the climate crisis means living your life. It doesn't mean becoming a martyr. It doesn't mean only doing one thing, because if you do that, if you become only the person who only ever talks about climate, then no one is going to listen to you. You are going to be no fun. And you are also going to become a rather narrow person. So this sense of trying to get a breadth in your life and to live your life as fully as you can in this very frightening context that we all find ourselves in is one of the key things which we're trying to get across in the groups.
Thank you, Ro. I'm going to hand back to Judith. Maybe you might have a couple more questions that you want us to respond to, or you may want to bring the Q&A to a close. I'm not sure whether you'd where we are in terms of timing.
There was a question about how can we find the meeting for facilitators, potential facilitators, and I asked if either Rachel or maybe Kate could share the link to that. I think it's on the CPA website. Oh yes, and yeah.
There is a mention, isn't there, of the community platform Mighty Networks in the chat. I think from Graham. And I just wanted to mention that Mighty Networks is what CPA uses for its own membership. And we have about 500 members, many of whom are now in the on the community platform, talking to each other about living with the climate crisis. It is for our members, and I've asked Rachel in the chat to put a link to how to join CPA, which I think has now happened. We're not here to sell CPA. We're not here to sell membership of CPA, but I just want to be clear that we are offering quite substantial amounts of support for facilitators, and in order to access most of that, you do need to be a member.
I noticed that there was a question about the metaphor of the ecosystem that we use. I think people were perhaps curious about that, and maybe just to say that we explain this really quite fully in the facilitator's guide, and so rather than going into a lot of detail here, I'd suggest that you check out what we say there. And it may well be something that you can develop, adapt, and talk about in your own ways with the groups that you work with.
And the other thing to say is that we will be saving the chat, in particular in relation to all your questions, because there may be some issues that have come up that will need clarifying, and perhaps in some way. And please keep them coming. So where would people send further questions, Rebecca? Or
probably the most straightforward thing is to go to the website and use the contact form there. That's a kind of systematic approach that would help us to respond in an organized way. I just wanted to say as well that I'm really delighted to see people beginning to share practices and concepts and materials with each other. And there was a suggestion further back to create a Google Doc that people can use to connect with each other. And if anyone has got the tech skills to whip over to Google Docs and set one up and share the link in the chat, then we hope then other people can use it both tonight and afterwards if people are watching it on YouTube or looking at the shared chat, the saved chat.
Is that's different from the one we've already shared, or the same?
No, it's a suggestion of just a simple Google Doc, not the Google form that we have created. And please do use that as well, because that invites you to share your contact details with other people. But no, this would be to start sharing ideas and connecting. It does sound like a good thing to do, but it's not something we're offering. And so this will be an invitation to anyone who's here who wants to do that.
right, okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for so elegantly facilitating response to those questions. And we could have stayed here for another hour, I think. But we are here to celebrate, as well as know that celebration is in the context of this dire existential crisis that we're all engaged in. But it's with immense gratitude that I would like to ask you all, I don't know if you have a cup of tea or a glass or something that perhaps you picked up in the break that you want to hold up to your screen. And shall we simply celebrate and say thank you so much, and may living with the climate crisis sail well in these really choppy times.
I just saw Teresa's plant and it's beautiful.
Lovely.
Lovely things, so many lovely things people are holding up. I can't see them all, but they look amazing.
So we got the chat.
And a picture of a beautiful spiral, lovely pictures, daffodils.
Gosh, fantastic.
And thank you all for coming, and I hope that you do feel that your questions have been heard, or at least there is the hope that that they will be answered in due course. And somebody has amazingly shared a Google link, but we will also share that when we put the recording up, or perhaps not actually, but there will be a way of getting this Google link to all participants. And we will be sharing the recording of this evening. So anything else anybody would like to say before we say? Okay. So thank you all for coming, and go well, and see many of you, I hope, in the future at other Living with the Climate Crisis meetings.